She walked through those doors the same way she always did. Chin up, heels striking marble like a clock counting down to something nobody in that lobby could see coming. A black woman, elegant, precise, carrying 2 years of work pressed against her chest in a structured black folder. She belonged there more than anyone in that building. She just hadn't been given permission to prove it yet. And then he moved. The bodyguard. Big as a wall, certain as concrete, and wrong in every way a person can be wrong about another person. He looked at her, really looked at her, and decided in that single careless moment that she didn't belong there. Not because of anything she had done, not because of anything she had said, because of what she looked like, because of who she was. He extended his arm. He pushed her. The folder hit the marble, in front of 12 witnesses, in front of the cameras, in front of the one pair of eyes he never considered. The cold, black, unblinking eyes of the most dangerous man in that building, watching every single second from 34 floors above. What the bodyguard didn't know, what nobody in that lobby knew, was that the woman he had just pushed to the floor was the one person in the entire organization that the Korean mafia boss had been quietly, secretly, obsessively protecting for over a year. The one person whose name was on an account he had built in the shadows. The one person who knew more about his empire than any of his soldiers ever would. He had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his career. And she hadn't even stood up yet. Before starting the story, comment down below where you were watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a particular kind of danger that never announces itself. It does not arrive with sirens or with shadows or with the theatrical weight of a storm gathering on the horizon. It arrives quietly, dressed in something ordinary. A Tuesday afternoon, a marble lobby catching the pale November light, the sound of heels striking polished stone in a rhythm so steady it almost sounds like a clock. It arrives in the shape of a woman carrying a black structured folder against her chest, gold hardware catching a single thread of fluorescent light as she moves through a door that, had anyone been paying the right kind of attention, they would have noticed opens automatically for her. Not because the sensors detected her weight. Because someone, 34 floors above, had programmed it that way. But no one was paying the right kind of attention. That is the nature of this story. That is the nature of most catastrophes that do not look like catastrophes until the moment they are already complete. Her name was Amara Osei, 28 years old, born in the Bronx to parents who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing and rebuilt themselves with the particular ferocity of people who understand that the world will not slow down to accommodate their grief. Her father had worked 2 jobs until his back gave out. Her mother had cleaned other people's floors until her hands stopped looking like her own. Amara had watched all of it with those almond-shaped eyes that missed nothing. And she had decided, at an age when most children were still deciding what to be for Halloween, that she would become the kind of person who owned the room she walked into, even if the room had never intended to include her. She had succeeded. Quietly, without ceremony, without anyone handing her a single thing that was not extracted from years of precision and discipline and an intelligence so finely calibrated it had learned to disguise itself as something less threatening. 2 years ago, Han Jae-won had hired her as his executive assistant for Han Group Enterprises, officially a technology and imports conglomerate headquartered in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of company whose website was clean and whose conference rooms smelled like money and restraint. Unofficially, Han Group was the American face of the Jomunryong, the Black Dragon, a Korean syndicate with roots deep enough to predate the careers of every government official currently tasked with monitoring it. Chae-won had interviewed 11 candidates before Amara. He had dismissed 10 of them within the first 4 minutes. The 11th had lasted 9. Amara had walked in, sat down across from him without being invited to sit, placed her own prepared briefing document on the table, a document that outlined 3 operational inefficiencies she had identified in Han Group's publicly available filings, and said simply, "Tell me what you actually need, and I will tell you whether I can provide it." He had looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he had said, "You start Monday." In the 2 years that followed, she had learned things about Han Group that no external auditor, no federal analyst, no rival syndicate operative had managed to piece together in a decade of trying. She had learned them not because Chae-won had told her, he told no one everything, but because she was the kind of person who paid attention to the spaces between words, to the documents that arrived without explanation, to the phone calls that happened in Korean and were followed by a particular quality of silence. She had learned, and she had organized, and she had made herself indispensable in a way that was deeper and more structural than anyone around her understood. The people on the lower floors of Han Group thought she was a very well-dressed secretary who occasionally sat in on meetings she probably did not fully understand. This was, of course, precisely what she needed them to think. She moved through the marble lobby that Tuesday with the specific economy of motion that belongs to people who are never uncertain about where they are going. The folder against her chest contained 3 sets of documents: financial transfer authorizations for a subsidiary operation in Busan, a preliminary restructuring proposal for a distribution agreement that had been bleeding losses for 7 months, and a single encrypted page that only she and Chae-won knew existed. She had prepared all of it the previous night, cross-referencing figures until past midnight, her apartment in Brooklyn quiet except for the sound of the city below and the low hum of her laptop. She had arrived at the building at 2:47 in the afternoon. The meeting was scheduled for 2:50. She was, as always, exactly on time. The lobby was a controlled environment in the way that all spaces belonging to organizations like the Black Dragon are controlled. Every surface designed to project legitimacy, every person in it occupying a precisely defined function, every camera positioned to eliminate blind spots. The receptionist nearest the main desk recognized her immediately and offered the small professional nod that had become their standard exchange. The second receptionist was on the phone, but caught her eye and lifted 2 fingers in a brief acknowledgement. These were not acts of warmth exactly. They were acts of calibrated awareness, the kind of recognition extended to someone whose proximity to power has been noted and filed accordingly. She walked toward the private elevator. She had taken that elevator every time she visited this building for 2 years. It was keyed to her biometric profile, authorized directly from the 34th floor, accessible to exactly 2 people in the entire organization. She had never had to explain herself at that elevator. She had never been stopped. Kang Hyun-soo was standing 6 feet from it when she arrived. He was the kind of man who filled space aggressively, not merely because of his size, though he was enormous. 115 kilograms of compressed military training, arranged into a shape that seemed almost architecturally impractical for a human body. It was something in the way he occupied the air around him, the slight forward lean of the shoulders, the chin angled downward in a way that was not humility, but its precise opposite. He had been with the Black Dragon for 8 years. He had been Chae-won's head of personal security for 3. He was, by every metric that the people around him could observe, exactly what he appeared to be: loyal, dangerous, and good at his job. What he was not good at, what he had never been required to examine, was the architecture of his own assumptions. He saw her coming. He had seen her before. He knew who she worked for. He had seen her in hallways and briefing rooms, and once, briefly, in the elevator itself. And yet something about that Tuesday, something about the particular quality of his mood, the argument he'd had that morning with a subordinate who had questioned one of his calls, the low-grade irritation that had been sitting in his chest since before he arrived at the building, combined with something older, something that lived beneath his awareness like sediment at the bottom of still water, to produce a decision so catastrophically miscalibrated that its consequences would outlast everything else he had ever done in his career. He stepped forward. He extended his arm. "Stop." She stopped. She looked at his arm. She looked at his face. Hyun-soo. The name came out level, unhurried. "You know who I am." "I know what you look like." The words arrived with a particular texture, smooth on the surface and sharp underneath. The kind of sentence that does its damage between the syllables. Visitors use the side entrance. Go around the building. Several people in the lobby had shifted their attention toward them. The movement was subtle, the way attention moves in rooms where danger is always theoretically possible, and people have learned to track its changes without appearing to do so. The first receptionist had gone very still. Amara did not move. "I have a meeting with Mr. Han, right now. He is expecting me." "Everyone has a meeting." And then he did it. He closed the distance between them, all 6 feet of him narrowing toward her, and placed his hand on her shoulder and pushed. It was not a violent shove. It was something more deliberate than that, and therefore something worse. A calibrated assertion of authority, of physical precedence, of the oldest and most exhausted argument in the world. You do not belong here, and I will use my body to make that point. The folder hit the marble. Her weight shifted onto the stiletto heel and she caught herself completely, spine straightening before the moment had fully registered in the room around her, one hand gripping the handbag, the other already moving to retrieve the folder from the floor. The lobby had gone quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when something irreversible has just occurred, and everyone present has understood it simultaneously. Amara straightened. She adjusted the thin gold belt at her waist. She looked at Kang Hyun-soo with an expression that contained no performance, no theatrics, no visible wound. Only the clean, cold recognition of someone who has seen this exact thing before and has long since decided how she will carry it. She said nothing. 34 floors above, behind a wall of glass that reflected Manhattan back at itself, a man who had not moved since the moment the lobby feed appeared on his security monitor stood with a crystal glass of whiskey held loosely in one hand, completely forgotten. Han Jae-won was watching. He had seen everything, and the part of him that he had spent 36 years building walls around. The part that no contract or threat or rival syndicate had ever touched, had just been reached. The elevator ride took 30 seconds. Amara counted them. Not deliberately. It was simply what her mind did in moments of controlled aftermath. The kind of mental accounting that keeps a person from feeling what they are not yet ready to feel. She watched her own reflection in the mirrored doors, and she noted, with the detachment of someone cataloging damage on a structure that belongs to someone else, that her hair was still perfect. The gold belt was straight. The folder was back in her hands, the documents inside undisturbed because she had secured them with the interior clasp the night before. A habit, A small discipline, one of hundreds of small disciplines that had built the life she was currently standing inside of. The shoulders still burned where his hand had been. She did not look at it. She did not touch it. She stood with her spine aligned and her chin level, and she breathed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who has learned that composure is not the absence of feeling, but the decision about where feeling is permitted to go. The doors opened. The 34th floor of Han Group Enterprises was a different country from the lobby below. Down there was marble and controlled light, and the performance of legitimate corporate architecture. Up here was something quieter and more honest. Dark wood, muted tones, walls that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. The kind of space designed not to impress visitors, but to think. There were no visitors on the 34th floor. There never were. Chae-won was standing at the window when she entered. His back was to her. Both hands were at his sides. The whiskey glass had been set down somewhere between the monitor and the window, its contents untouched and warming. He was looking at Manhattan with the expression of a man who owns nothing and is calculating what it would cost him to change that, which was almost exactly the opposite of true. The dragon on his neck was visible from where she stood, the black lines climbing from collar to jaw, the detail so precise it seemed to move when the light shifted. She set the folder on the conference table. She smoothed the front of her skirt once, a gesture so small it barely registered. "You're well?" His voice arrived before he turned. Low, unhurried, scraped clean of everything except the question itself. "I'm fine. I brought the Busan transfer authorizations and the restructuring proposal for the distribution agreement. We need signatures before the end of business or the subsidiary window closes and we lose the..." Amara. He said her name the way he always said it. Not as a summons, not as a title, but as something he had decided to handle carefully. The way you handle something whose value you understand better than the people around you. He turned, and she saw it. She had worked beside this man for 2 years, had sat across from him in rooms where other people were performing fear, and she was performing competence. Had watched his face in negotiations where his expression never shifted by a single degree, regardless of what was happening. She had learned to read the architecture of his stillness, the grammar of what his silence meant in each of its variations. This was a variation she had not seen before. "I was watching the monitor." He said it simply, without preamble, without the careful layering of language he typically deployed. "I saw everything." She held his gaze. "You don't need to act on it. It's been handled before, and it can be..." "It has not been handled." The voice stayed low, but something beneath it tightened, the way a cable tightens before it snaps, the tension becoming audible only in the last moment before the break. "What happened in that lobby has not been handled. What happened in that lobby will not be something I observe and file away. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Manhattan continued its indifferent business. Helicopters crossing the gray sky, the geometry of glass and steel holding its shape against the cold. "I understand that you're angry." She chose the words with precision. "I also understand that whatever you're planning to do, you need to be certain it comes from the right place." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means..." She set her hand flat on the folder. "That if you act because your operation was disrupted and the member of your team made a decision that reflects badly on your organization, that is one thing. That is rational. That is appropriate." She paused. But if you act for another reason, Chaewon, if you act because of something that exists between this office and me that we have not named and have not addressed, then you need to be honest with yourself about which reason is actually driving you. Because one of those reasons is clean, and one of them is complicated. The room held the weight of what she had just said. Han Chaewon, who had sat across tables from men who had tried to end his life and had never once lost the architecture of his composure, stood very still for 4 full seconds. Then he crossed to the desk. He picked up the phone. He dialed the number that connected to his personal assistant on the floor below. Not to Hyun-soo directly, because Chaewon did not dignify certain communications with directness. He spoke 3 sentences in Korean. The call lasted 11 seconds. He set the phone down. "Sit down," he said. "We'll review the Busan documents while we wait." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. And they worked. Actually worked. The way they always worked, with a fluency and efficiency that had developed over 2 years of proximity into something that functioned almost like a shared language. He read, she annotated. He asked questions that were precise and specific. She answered them without elaboration because he did not need elaboration. Outside the window, the sky had shifted from pale gray to the particular bruised gold of a late afternoon in November. They were reviewing the 3rd document when the knock came. The door opened, and Kang Hyun-soo filled the frame. He was still in the same charcoal suit, still carrying the physical authority that had been his professional identity for 8 years. But something in the set of his face had already changed in the elevator ride up. Some calculation running behind the eyes as he processed the fact that he had been called here without his weapon, which was a language he understood perfectly. He looked at Amara, then at Chaewon. Chaewon looked up from the document in his hand. He did not ask Hyun-soo to sit. He did not raise his voice. He set the document down with the precise, unhurried placement of someone who has all the time in the world because the outcome of this conversation was decided before it began. What followed lasted 4 minutes and did not contain a single raised syllable. Amara sat at the table with the folder in front of her and heard not words but tones. The flat, unmodulated cadence of Chaewon speaking Korean in the register that his people called the cold room, because it felt like being in a space where the temperature had been deliberately lowered to a point just above what the body could survive. She heard Hyun-soo respond once, twice, a 3rd time, each response shorter than the last, each one smaller, the way a person becomes smaller when the architecture of what they believed about their own position begins to be systematically disassembled. She did not look at him. She looked at the transfer authorization documents, and she thought about the woman her mother had been. Tired, precise, dignified in ways that no one around her ever thought to acknowledge. She thought about the floors her mother had cleaned, and the negotiations she had watched her father conduct with landlords who spoke to him like he was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. She thought about all of the spaces she had entered in her life where someone had decided, before she opened her mouth, what she was and what she was not. And she thought about the extraordinary cost of carrying that knowledge silently, professionally, without letting it surface in ways that would be used against her. The cost was real. It had always been real. But so was everything she had built on the other side of it. When Hyun-soo left the room, he did not look at her. His hands, she noticed in her peripheral vision, were not entirely steady. The door closed behind him with the soft precision of expensive hinges. No slam, no drama, just the quiet mechanical completion of a threshold being crossed. Chae-won was silent for a moment. Then he returned to the document. Page 3, he said. The secondary authorization clause. Walk me through the risk assessment. She found the page. She began to speak. Her voice was level and exact and gave away nothing. But beneath the table, in the privacy of her own lap, her hand had closed into a fist. Not with rage, not with grief, but with the particular tension of someone who has held something very heavy for a very long time and has just been reminded, without warning, of exactly how heavy it is. She kept speaking. She kept her voice level. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room full of people who have underestimated them is simply to keep going. And she kept going. The meeting ended at 6 in the evening. The Busan documents were signed. The restructuring proposal was approved, with 2 amendments that Amara had anticipated and already prepared counter-language for. And the encrypted page, the one that existed in no filing system, in no digital record, in no conversation that had ever been overheard, was reviewed, acknowledged, and returned to the folder without comment. This was the rhythm of their work together. Clean, efficient, built on a foundation of mutual comprehension that had grown so precise over 2 years that it had begun to resemble something neither of them had a professional word for. When she stood to leave, Chae-won spoke without looking up from the final document he was signing. Why did you never tell me? She paused with her hand on the folder's clasp. Tell you what, specifically? That it happens. He set the pen down. That people in this building, people in my organization, treat you in ways that have nothing to do with your function here. The question was direct in a way that was unusual for him. Chae-won Han operated almost exclusively in implication and inference, in the architecture of what was not said. A direct question from him carried weight precisely because of its rarity. She considered the answer honestly before she gave it. Because, she said, telling you would have required me to ask you for something. And I have spent my entire life being very careful about what I ask for and who I ask it from. Not because I don't believe I deserve it. She looked at him steadily. But because the moment a woman like me asks a man like you for protection, the entire nature of what I've built here changes. I stop being the person who runs the operation. I become the person who needed to be protected. And those are not the same thing. They will never be the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. The November light coming through the window behind him had gone fully dark now, replaced by the electric geometry of the city at night. 1,000 lit windows stacked against the black sky, each one a room full of people who did not know this conversation was happening. That, he said quietly, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in this office in 3 years. She picked up the folder. I'll have the revised Busan timeline on your desk by 9 tomorrow morning. She left, and Han Chae-won sat alone in the 34th floor office with the unsigned final page still in his hand and a feeling in his chest that he had no professional category for. A feeling that sat precisely at the intersection of admiration and shame, and something older and more inconvenient than either. He had known, in the abstract way that powerful people know things they do not fully examine, that Amara moved through his world carrying a weight he had never been required to carry. He had understood it intellectually the way a man who has never been cold understands winter. As a concept, as a data point, as something real that happened to other people in conditions he could observe, but not inhabit. What he had not understood, until she laid it out with the same precision she applied to financial restructuring proposals, was the specific cost of her silence. The strategic calculation behind it. The fact that she had looked at the very protection he might have offered and determined, correctly, that accepting it would have cost her something more valuable than the injury it prevented. She had been protecting herself from the protection. And the man who had made that protection necessary was currently on a flight path toward Busan that Jae-won had set in motion with 11 seconds and 3 sentences, and would arrive there to find a posting that was technically a promotion and functionally an erasure. A removal so complete and so permanent that Kang Hyun-soo would spend the rest of his career in an office that smelled like salt air and diminishing relevance, never fully understanding the precise sequence of events that had placed him there. This was how Jae-won operated. Not with violence, or not primarily, not for something like this. With architecture. With the slow, irresistible rearrangement of the world around a person until the world no longer had a place for them. It was, he reflected, a method Amara would have understood perfectly. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of New York morning that looks like a photograph of itself. Sharp edges, high contrast, the sky an almost aggressive shade of blue above the canyon of buildings. Amara arrived at the Han Group building at 8:52. She had the revised Busan timeline, 3 additional documents that had occurred to her during the night, and a coffee that she had finished 2 blocks ago. The lobby was different. Not visibly, not in any way that a stranger would have detected. The marble was the same marble. The light was the same controlled fluorescent cool. The receptionists were at their stations with the same professional composure. But the air had shifted in the specific way that air shifts inside organizations when something has happened that everyone knows about and no one is discussing. A collective recalibration, an adjustment of invisible hierarchies, the whole system quietly updating itself around new information. Hyun-soo was not at his post. There was a different man near the private elevator, younger, less certain in his posture, positioned with the careful attentiveness of someone who has been given very specific instructions about very specific people. When Amara approached, he stepped aside immediately and with a small, deliberate nod that was different in quality from anything she had received from a security member in this building before. It was not the nod of someone acknowledging a colleague. It was the nod of someone who has been told, in terms that required no elaboration, exactly who they are looking at. She pressed her palm to the biometric panel. The elevator opened. She rode up in the mirrored box and looked at her reflection and noted, with the same detached precision as the day before, that she was the same person. Same black power, same gold at her throat, same exactness of posture. Everything external was unchanged. And yet something in the building's posture toward her had shifted, subtly, irrevocably, in the way that tectonic plates shift, invisibly, beneath the surface, until the landscape above is permanently different. She was not certain how she felt about that. This was the part that no one ever discussed. The aftermath of a moment like the one in the lobby. Not the satisfying version that stories tend to deliver in clean packages of justice and resolution, but the complicated, textured reality of what it means when the world corrects itself around you. Because correction, even when it is correct, arrives with its own weight. She had not asked for any of this. She had not asked Jae-won to dismantle Hyun-soo's career. She had not asked for the new quality of the nods, the recalibrated posture of the lobby, the particular way the younger security man had stepped aside. She had asked for nothing. And yet here was the consequence. The organization rearranging itself and her sitting at the center of the rearrangement, which was a kind of power she had spent 2 years carefully not appearing to hold. The doors opened. Jaewon was at his desk when she entered, which was unusual. He was typically at the window in the mornings, coffee in hand, doing whatever it was he did in that first hour that he never described, and she had long since learned not to ask about. He was reading something. He looked up when she came in with an expression that was fractionally more open than his standard professional register, as though something had been adjusted overnight by a very small, very precise degree. 9 o'clock, he said. You're early. It's 8:58. She set the folder on the table and began sorting the documents. The revised Pusan timeline accounts for the amended clause from yesterday. I also pulled the subsidiary performance data for the last 4 quarters, because the numbers in the original proposal were using a baseline that doesn't reflect current market conditions in that region. The projection was optimistic by about 18%. He was quiet for a moment. You did that last night? This morning, 4:30. She said it without emphasis, without performance. It was simply information. Amara. She looked up from the documents. He had set down what he was reading, and he was looking at her with that expression again. The one from yesterday evening. The one that lived at the intersection of things he did not have professional language for. Up close, in the morning light, the dragon on his neck was intricate and total. The lines precise as a blueprint, the ideograms on the right side sitting just below the jaw, like a sentence he had decided to make permanent. What I said yesterday, he began, and then stopped. Which was remarkable. Han Jae-won did not begin sentences he was not prepared to finish. She waited. When I said you were mine. He held her gaze. That was not a professional statement. And I am aware that I have not given you any framework in which that statement makes sense. I am aware that I have no right to make it. I am aware... And here something shifted in the careful stonework of his expression, something that looked almost like the word vulnerable applied to a person who had never been required to learn it. That I have kept something from you that you deserved to know. Not because I did not trust you, because I did not trust what knowing it would do to everything we had built. The morning light came through the window behind him and caught the gold of her necklace and the gold of his cufflinks, and the room held very still around the two of them. She looked at him for a long time. Then tell me now, she said. And the city outside kept its indifferent roar, and the documents sat unsigned on the table between them, and Han Jae-won, who had never in 36 years been afraid of a single thing he could name, opened his mouth and told her the truth. He told her about the account first. That was where he began. Not with words about feeling, not with the language of confession that she might have expected from a man who had just admitted to keeping something from her, but with a fact. A specific, verifiable, financial fact. Because this was who he was. A man who expressed the most interior things in the most exterior terms. Who had learned to love, if that was even the word, through architecture rather than declaration. There was an account, he said, offshore, established 14 months ago, in her name. She did not move. He told her the number. The figure arrived in the room like a physical object, something with mass and weight, something that displaced air. It was not a sum that suggested gesture or sentiment. It was a sum that suggested permanence, planning. The kind of number that a person arrives at not through impulse, but through sustained, deliberate intention maintained over more than a year. "You did this," she said. And her voice was level, but underneath it something was moving. Something she was holding very carefully, without telling me. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that he was quiet when he was not constructing an answer, but locating one. Finding it somewhere inside himself where it had been sitting, fully formed, waiting for the moment when it would be required. "Because," he said, "I needed to know that if something happened to this organization, if something happened to me, you would not be left in a position where the 2 years you gave to this work disappeared with everything else. You came here with nothing that this world owed you anything. You built everything you have inside a structure that could be dismantled at any moment by forces that have nothing to do with your competence or your worth. I was not willing to let that be the end of your story if the structure fell." The morning had gone very quiet around them. "That is not a professional decision," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She looked at the documents on the table between them, the Poussin timeline, the subsidiary analysis, the amended clauses, the encrypted page. 2 years of work, laid out in neat ordered stacks, each page representing a night she had stayed late, a calculation she had run twice to be certain, a decision she had made that had kept the architecture of his world intact when it might otherwise have cracked. "You should have told me," she said. Not with anger, with the specific weight of someone identifying a wrong that cannot be corrected retroactively, only acknowledged. "I know. I am not something to be protected without my knowledge, Taewon. I am not a variable you manage quietly to produce a preferred outcome. I am a person who makes her own decisions about her own risk." She held his gaze. "If you had told me, I could have decided what I wanted to do with that information. Instead, you decided for me, and you dressed it in care, which makes it harder to be angry about, but it does not make it right." He did not flinch. He did not deflect. He received what she said with the full stillness of someone who has decided not to defend the indefensible. "You're correct," he said. "In every particular. You are correct." The acknowledgement landed differently than she expected. She had prepared herself, somewhere in the 3 seconds between his admission and her response, for the defensive architecture that men in his position typically deployed when challenged. The reframing, the justification, the subtle repositioning of the argument until the person challenging them found themselves somehow in the wrong. She had seen it done with extraordinary skill in the 2 years she had spent in his orbit. She had watched him dismantle opposing positions with a precision that left the other person uncertain whether they had been defeated or simply clarified. He did none of that. He simply said she was right, and he meant it, and the simplicity of it was more disarming than anything complicated could have been. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, Manhattan was fully awake now. The sky had shifted from morning blue to the complex layered gray of midday, and the city below moved in its perpetual urgent motion, indifferent and relentless and completely unaware that in a room on the 34th floor of a building it passed every day, something was being decided that would quietly alter the shape of several lives. "The account," she said finally. "I'm not closing it." He waited. "Not because I accept how it was done." She was precise. "But because the instinct behind it, the part of you that decided my security mattered, that part I understand. That part I can work with." She paused. "But nothing like that happens again without my knowledge. Nothing that involves me gets decided without me. Are we clear?" Perfectly, he said. And then, after a beat, "Are we still reviewing the Poussin documents?" And she almost laughed. Almost, not quite. The corner of her mouth moving a fraction of a degree in a direction that was not her professional expression. "We are. Page 1. The amended authorization clause." They worked. 3 weeks passed in the continuous forward motion of an organization that does not pause for the interior weather of its principles. The Poussin restructuring was executed cleanly. The subsidiary distribution agreement was renegotiated along the lines of Amara's revised proposal, recovering 11 of the 18 percentage points she had identified as lost. 2 new alliance partnerships were established through a series of meetings that Amara ran, not in support of Chaewon, not beside him, but in her own right, as the person in the room with the most complete picture of what Han Group needed and what it was prepared to offer. The people in those meetings noticed. They noticed with the specific attention of individuals whose professional survival depends on accurately reading the map of power in any room they enter. They noticed the way Chaewon deferred to her analysis without it being framed as deference. They noticed the way she spoke with the fluency of someone who had access to information that did not appear on any official organizational chart. They noticed that when she finished speaking, he did not elaborate or correct. He simply moved forward as though her word were already the agreed position. They recalibrated. This is the way power announces itself in the world that Chaewon Han inhabited. Not through titles, not through declarations, not through the dramatic public gestures that lesser organizations used to establish hierarchy. Through the quiet, accumulating evidence of who in a room controls the direction of things. Through the pattern of who speaks before a decision and who speaks after. Through the small, repeated, consistent signals that aggregate over time into something that cannot be argued with. Amara had always been this. The organization was simply learning to see it. The dinner happened on a Thursday evening at a restaurant that did not have a sign outside and did not appear on any public listing. A private room on the upper floor of a building in Koreatown that had been used for exactly this kind of meeting for 11 years. 12 people around a table. Alliance heads, financial architects, 2 men whose names appeared on legitimate boards of directors in Seoul and in Singapore, and 1 woman in a fitted black dress with a thin gold necklace catching the candlelight. A small structured black handbag hung over the back of her chair. Her black power immaculate, her wine-dark lipstick precise. Her notebook open in front of her with handwriting so small and dense it looked like its own encryption. Chaewon sat at the head of the table. She sat to his right. The meeting proceeded through 3 agenda items without incident. On the 4th, a proposed expansion into a new distribution corridor that had been under preliminary discussion for 6 months, one of the alliance heads, a man named Park, who ran 3 legitimate shipping companies and 2 that were considerably less legitimate, leaned forward with the careful smile of someone deploying a question that is actually a test. "Perhaps we might hear the strategic assessment from Mr. Han's team." He glanced at Amara with the particular quality of attention that dismisses as it looks. "Or perhaps Mr. Han can summarize the position himself to save time." The table went very slightly still. Chaewon set down his glass. He looked at Park with an expression of complete, untroubled calm. "Ms. Osei has the complete strategic assessment," he said. "She built it. She knows it better than I do. If you have a question about this corridor, you address it to her. If the answer she gives you is not sufficient, I will be genuinely surprised." Park's smile recalibrated. The table recalibrated with it. Amara opened her notebook to the relevant page. She looked at Park with the expression that had always stopped rooms. Not aggressive, not performing, simply present with a completeness that made it clear she had anticipated this moment and had prepared for it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. "The corridor, as currently proposed," she said, "has 3 structural vulnerabilities that the preliminary assessment did not account for. I've prepared a revised framework that addresses all 3 and recovers the projected margin. Should I begin with the financial exposure or the logistical architecture?" Park looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had just discovered, in real time, that his test had been administered to someone who had already written and graded it. "The financial exposure," he said. "Please." She began. And around that table, in a room with no sign and no listing and no record that it had ever existed, the 12 people who represented the architecture of an empire that operated in the spaces between legitimate worlds listened to a woman from the Bronx, daughter of immigrants, builder of her own precision, carrier of a weight that none of them had ever been required to understand. And they listened the way people listen when they have understood, finally and completely, that the person speaking is not in the room to support the authority. She is the authority. Later, in the car moving through Manhattan at midnight, the city sliding past the windows in its rivers of light, she looked out at the streets and thought about her mother's hands, about the floors, about the ocean that had been crossed, about all of the rooms that had been entered before this one. Smaller rooms, harder rooms, rooms that had tried to say you do not belong here in every language available to that sentiment. She thought about Hyun-soo somewhere in Busan, in an office that smelled like the sea, slowly understanding the shape of what he had lost without ever fully understanding why. She thought about the account with her name on it, the one she had not closed, would not close, which sat somewhere in the offshore architecture of a man's complicated and imperfectly expressed care for her, earning interest. Taewon was beside her, looking forward, one hand resting on his knee, the city light moving across the dragon on his neck in slow, shifting patterns that made it look, for just a moment, like it was breathing. "You know, this changes everything," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact, delivered with the same tone she used for financial projections. "I know," he said. "The organization will adjust. Some of them will resist. There will be conversations we haven't had yet that will be difficult." "I know that too." "And you're certain?" He turned to look at her then. In the moving light of midnight Manhattan, with the dragon climbing his neck and the cufflinks catching the glow of a passing street lamp, and the cold precision of his face softened by something that had no name in the vocabulary of the world he had built. He looked at her with the absolute, unqualified certainty of a man who has spent 36 years being certain about the wrong things, and has finally, at considerable cost to his own carefully constructed interior architecture, become certain about the right one. "I have been certain," he said, "for longer than I told you." The car moved forward through the city. The lights streamed past. Somewhere below them, Manhattan kept its perpetual roar. Indifferent, relentless, enormous, and completely unaware that inside one moving car, crossing one lit bridge, 2 people who had built something extraordinary in the space between what they said and what they meant, had finally, quietly, without announcement or ceremony, decided to stop pretending that the space was empty. She looked back out the window. She did not smile. She did not need to. She simply looked at the city that had tried, in 100 different ways and through 100 different instruments, to tell her she did not belong in its largest rooms. And she let herself feel, for one unguarded moment, the full and wordless weight of still being here, still going, still hers. Sometimes the problem is not a lack of love. It is spending too much time in places where you have to make yourself smaller just to keep being chosen. And when that becomes a pattern, a woman starts to think it is normal to live in doubt, in waiting, in confusion.
But it is not normal, and it does not have to continue that way. That is why I created this process, to help women see what used to go unnoticed, stop accepting less than they deserve, and trust themselves again. Today, it is available at a very special price, from $67 to just $9.90. More than 50 women have already joined, and many of them said they were finally able to name what they had been living through. If you want to start now, you can access it through the QR code on the screen, the link in the description, or the pinned comment. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room and been judged before you ever opened your mouth? Dismissed because of how you looked, where you came from, or who people assumed you were before they gave themselves a single second to find out? Have you ever carried your worth in silence, choosing not to ask for what you deserved because you knew that asking would change how the world saw you, and you refused to give anyone that power over your story? And have you ever witnessed the moment when someone who was underestimated stopped being invisible? Not because they fought for it, not because they demanded it, but simply because they never stopped going. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, hidden strength, and the kind of justice that arrives quietly but completely, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.